The night was heavy with the kind of silence that amplifies every small sound, every creak in the walls, every rustle of the wind. In a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, 10-year-old Ethan Davis sat by the window, watching the rain beat against the glass. His eyes, wide and thoughtful, reflected both the flickering streetlights and the worry that weighed on his young mind. Ethan had always been more mature than the other kids his age. Since his father's sudden passing a few years ago, he had taken on the role of the protector of his small family. It was just him and his mother, Clara, now. And tonight, Clara was lying in bed, her swollen belly a constant reminder that their family was about to grow. She had been carrying the baby for 9 long months, but the last few weeks had been particularly tough. She was tired, more tired than Ethan had ever seen her, and he knew deep down that something wasn't right. Ethan looked toward his mother's bedroom door, slightly ajar, where he could hear her faint, labored breathing. A sense of helplessness washed over him. They lived alone, with no close relatives nearby. There was no phone in the apartment, and the nearest hospital was miles away. Clara had told him to rest, that she would be fine, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to be ready for anything. Clara had always been his source of strength, a constant in his life when everything else felt uncertain. She had a way of making him feel safe, even when the world outside seemed so much bigger and scarier than he could comprehend. Tonight, though, he saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear she was trying to hide. Suddenly, a low moan broke the stillness. Ethan leapt from his chair, heart pounding, and rushed into his mother's room. Clara was struggling, beads of sweat dotting her forehead, her hands gripping the bedsheets as another wave of pain overtook her. "Mom." Ethan's voice was shaky, filled with the panic of a child who didn't know what to do. "Mom, what's happening?" Clara opened her eyes, the pain evident in her expression, but she forced a weak smile. "It's time," she whispered. "The baby's coming." Ethan's stomach tightened in fear. They were completely alone. He had heard stories from his mother about how labor could take hours, even days, and yet here she was, struggling to breathe, barely able to move. His mind raced, trying to remember everything she had told him about what to do if something went wrong. Clara's breathing became more ragged, and with a weak groan, she clutched her belly. "Ethan. I need you to stay calm," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If something happens, you need to get help." In that moment, Ethan knew his life was about to change. The weight of responsibility settled on his small shoulders, and despite the fear that churned inside him, he nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. He would do whatever it took to protect his family. Ethan stood frozen in place for a moment, watching his mother's chest rise and fall in uneven breaths. Clara's pain was palpable, filling the room with a tension that Ethan had never experienced before. His heart raced as his mind tried to grasp the severity of the situation. He was only 10 years old, and yet he felt the weight of the entire world pressing down on him. What if something went wrong? What if he wasn't strong enough to help her? Clara moaned again, her body trembling as another wave of pain washed over her. She tried to speak, but her voice came out in a strained whisper. "Ethan, listen to me. You need to be brave now." Her words, though quiet, carried an unmistakable urgency. Ethan snapped into action, moving to her side, grasping her hand. It felt cold and clammy, a stark contrast to the warmth and strength he had always known from her. His mother, his protector, the woman who had held him through his nightmares and comforted him when he was scared, now lay helpless before him. He didn't know what to do, but he wasn't going to let her down. He had to try. "Mom, what do I do?" "What do you need?" he asked, his voice shaking. Clara winced through another contraction, her grip tightening on his hand. The baby's coming," she whispered, her breath shallow and rapid. "I don't have much time, Ethan. You need to be ready." Ethan's mind raced. He knew enough about childbirth to realize that this wasn't normal. His mother had always told him that babies should be born in hospitals, where doctors could help if things went wrong. But there was no doctor here. There was no one but him. He glanced at the clock on the wall, the hands ticking loudly in the otherwise quiet room. It was nearly midnight. He thought about the hospital across town, a place he'd only been to once or twice when he was younger. It seemed impossibly far away, and without a phone or transportation, how could he possibly get there in time? Clara let out another pained groan, her face contorting in agony. She clutched her belly, beads of sweat glistening on her forehead. "Ethan," she gasped, "the baby, he's stuck." Ethan's eyes widened. Stuck? What did that mean? He looked down at her belly, panic rising in his chest. His mother's breathing was becoming more erratic, and her skin had taken on a pale, almost grayish hue. The baby was coming, but something was terribly wrong. "I can't breathe," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible now. Her eyes fluttered closed as another wave of exhaustion hit her. "Ethan, please." The words hung in the air, unfinished, but Ethan knew what she was asking. He had to get help. Now. His heart hammered in his chest as he made a decision that no child should ever have to make. He quickly grabbed a blanket from the bed and wrapped the newborn as best as he could. The baby had been born just moments ago, and Ethan could already see that something was wrong. He wasn't crying, wasn't moving like a newborn should. His tiny body looked limp, fragile, and terrifyingly still. Ethan's hands trembled as he wrapped the baby tighter in the blanket. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel the enormity of the situation weighing down on him. This was life and death. And if he didn't act now, both his mother and his baby brother could be lost. Clara's face was now slack, her breathing dangerously shallow. Ethan knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had no choice but to leave her behind, hoping that she would hold on just a little longer while he got help. "I'll be back, Mom. I promise," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, wiping away the tears that had started to blur his vision. With the newborn cradled in his arms, Ethan sprinted out of the apartment. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face, but he didn't slow down. His legs pumped furiously beneath him as he ran through the rain-soaked streets, his sneakers splashing in puddles, the baby's tiny form pressed tightly against his chest. Every step felt like a race against time, a desperate bid to keep his family alive. The city streets were eerily quiet, save for the sound of his ragged breathing and the occasional distant car. Ethan's thoughts raced as fast as his feet, fear and adrenaline propelling him forward. What if he didn't make it in time? What if something happened to the baby before they reached the hospital? He pushed those thoughts aside, focusing only on the path ahead. He knew the way to the hospital. It was near the park where he used to play with his friends, a place that now felt a million miles away. He had to reach it. There was no other option. The city loomed large around him, the tall buildings casting long, ominous shadows across the streets. Ethan darted across intersections, ignoring the few honks of cars that whizzed by. His mind was singularly focused on one thing, saving his brother. The baby still hadn't made a sound. Ethan's fear deepened with every passing second, but he didn't let himself stop. He couldn't. His breath came in sharp gasps, his muscles burning from the effort, but he didn't dare slow down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the glowing lights of the hospital came into view, shining like a beacon of hope in the distance. Ethan's heart leaped in his chest. He was almost there. His legs screamed in protest as he pushed himself to run faster, the weight of his brother in his arms growing heavier with each step. But he couldn't stop. Not now. As he approached the emergency entrance, he burst through the automatic doors, his voice breaking in desperation as he shouted, "Please! Help! My little brother needs help!" The cold night air hit Ethan's face as he dashed out of the apartment building, the blanket-wrapped newborn tight in his arms. His breath came out in quick, frantic gasps, mixing with the mist rising from the wet pavement. Rain pelted his face, stinging his skin, but he couldn't stop. He didn't even have time to think. The only thing that mattered was getting to the hospital before it was too late. The city seemed so much larger at night, more ominous, as if it had expanded in size, just to mock his desperation. Tall buildings loomed overhead like dark, silent sentinels, and the streets, usually bustling with life, now felt deserted, almost ghostly. The streetlights flickered in the rain, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch out toward him, but Ethan forced himself to focus. The weight of the newborn in his arms wasn't much physically, but the responsibility of keeping his brother alive weighed heavily on his mind. Caleb, his baby brother, was still unnervingly quiet. No cries, no movement. Ethan could barely see the baby's face, but he could feel the small, fragile body nestled against his chest, far too still for comfort. The thought that something might already be wrong gnawed at him, but he didn't allow himself to dwell on it. There was no time for fear, no time to think about what might happen if he didn't make it. He just had to run. His sneakers splashed through puddles as he raced across the uneven pavement, his breath coming in labored pants. The rain had picked up, soaking his clothes, and making the air thick with humidity. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed his legs harder, faster, ignoring the sharp burn in his muscles. He had never run this fast before, but every step felt too slow. The hospital was across town, near the park where he used to play, but tonight, it felt like a world away. As he rounded a corner, his foot slipped on the wet ground, and for a terrifying moment, he felt himself teeter, almost losing his balance. His arms instinctively tightened around Caleb, and with a quick jolt, he regained his footing, stumbling forward without slowing down. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept going. He had no choice. The streets seemed endless, stretching out into a blur of slick pavement and indistinct buildings. Ethan's sense of direction was clouded by the rain and his rising panic. For a second, he thought he had taken a wrong turn. The hospital was supposed to be close by now, wasn't it? Fear surged in his chest, but then he caught sight of a familiar landmark, the old bakery with the cracked neon sign, just a few blocks from the park. Relief surged through him. He was on the right track. As he passed the park, the memories of playing here with his friends flashed through his mind. The games of tag, the afternoons spent climbing trees and racing around the swings, it all seemed so distant now, like a lifetime ago. Tonight, the park was empty, the swings swaying in the wind, the trees bending under the weight of the rain. It looked different, eerie, as if it too had been transformed by the gravity of what was happening. Ethan's legs felt like they were made of lead, each step heavier than the last. His breath was coming in ragged gasps now, and his vision was beginning to blur from the rain and exhaustion. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He glanced down at Caleb, his heart tightening. The baby's small face was pale, his chest barely moving with shallow breaths. Ethan's fear spiked, but he pushed it down. Caleb was still breathing. He just needed to get him to the hospital. The city's emptiness felt overwhelming. It was as though the entire world had gone to sleep, leaving Ethan alone in his desperate race against time. He passed darkened storefronts, their windows reflecting his frantic image back at him, but he couldn't afford to be distracted. There were no cars on the road, no people walking by, just the endless expanse of wet streets and the distant, blurry lights of the hospital glowing like a beacon in the rain. A car whizzed by suddenly, spraying water onto the sidewalk. Ethan barely had time to react as the cold splash hit his legs, soaking through his already drenched jeans. He stumbled, but quickly regained his footing, clutching Caleb closer. There was no time to stop, no time to feel the cold or the ache in his muscles. He had to keep going. As he approached a crosswalk, the traffic light turned red, and the hum of an approaching car filled the air. Ethan didn't stop to wait for the light to change. He darted across the street, narrowly avoiding the car's headlights. The driver honked, the sound blaring through the rain, but Ethan didn't even look back. His eyes were fixed on the hospital up ahead. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached the glowing lights of the emergency entrance. His heart raced as he pushed through the automatic doors, the warmth of the hospital lobby washing over him like a wave of relief. The bright fluorescent lights contrasted sharply with the dark, wet city outside, but Ethan barely noticed. His only thought was of Caleb. "Help," he shouted, his voice raw with panic. "Please, someone help." The hospital staff looked up in shock as they saw the drenched boy standing in the entrance, clutching a tiny bundle against his chest. Ethan staggered forward, his legs trembling, his heart pounding in his ears. His voice cracked as he cried out again, desperation thick in his words. "My brother, he's not breathing right. Please, he needs help." A nurse rushed over, her face filled with concern. Ethan felt his knees begin to buckle, exhaustion finally catching up to him. But he didn't let go of Caleb. Not until the nurse gently took the baby from his arms, rushing toward the emergency room as Ethan stood there, drenched and trembling, watching helplessly as his brother disappeared through the doors. The moment Ethan burst through the hospital doors, the world seemed to blur around him. The stark brightness of the fluorescent lights contrasted with the rain-soaked night outside, almost blinding him after the darkness of the city streets. His legs wobbled, his heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came out in ragged gasps. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. "Please. Help. My little brother needs help." Ethan's voice was raw, strained from both exhaustion and fear. The weight of Caleb's tiny body in his arms felt heavier now, as if the fear of losing him had settled into his bones. The nurses and staff at the front desk turned their heads, startled by the sight of the small boy, drenched to the bone, clutching a bundle tightly against his chest. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes wide with panic. He was just a child, but there was something fierce in his gaze, a determination that could not be ignored. One of the nurses, a woman in her mid-30s with kind eyes, rushed over to him. "What's happening?" "Let me see," she said, her voice calm but urgent. She crouched down to his level, reaching for the blanket in his arms. Ethan's grip tightened instinctively around his brother, but he forced himself to relax, knowing that the nurse was there to help. Slowly, he opened the blanket to reveal Caleb's pale, motionless face. He's not breathing right," Ethan stammered, his voice breaking. "Please, do something. He's only just been born. My mom, she fainted. I didn't know what to do. I ran here." The nurse's expression shifted from concern to immediate action. She quickly scooped Caleb from Ethan's arms, her trained hands already assessing the baby's condition. "We need a doctor, now," she called over her shoulder as she stood, cradling the infant carefully. "Possible respiratory distress in a newborn." Ethan tried to follow her as she hurried toward the emergency room doors, but his legs finally gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold tile floor. A second nurse was by his side in an instant, gently helping him up and guiding him to a nearby chair. "Sit down, sweetheart," the nurse said softly, placing a warm hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing. Let us take care of your brother now. You're safe here." Ethan barely heard her. His eyes were locked on the door through which the first nurse had disappeared with Caleb. His heart raced with the fear that it was already too late. What if he hadn't run fast enough? What if Caleb didn't make it? The thought was too much to bear, and his chest tightened painfully as he fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. The nurse beside him knelt down to his level, her voice soothing and calm. "What's your name, sweetheart? Can you tell me what happened?" "Ethan. Ethan Davis," he mumbled, still staring at the emergency room door. "My brother, his name is Caleb." He was just born. My mom, she's still at home. She fainted after the baby came out. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran here. The nurse's face softened as she listened, her heart aching for the young boy in front of her. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his small body trembled from the cold and the strain of what he had been through. She gently placed a hand on his arm. You were very brave, Ethan. You saved your brother's life by bringing him here. We're going to take care of him, and we'll make sure your mom gets the help she needs, too. Ethan nodded numbly, but his eyes never left the door. The weight of everything that had happened was crashing down on him now, and his body felt heavy with exhaustion. He wanted to believe the nurse's words, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Caleb was so small, so fragile. What if he couldn't fight through this? Meanwhile, in the emergency room, Dr. Collins had been wrapping up his shift when he heard the commotion in the hallway. As soon as he saw the nurse rushing in with the newborn, his instincts kicked in. What do we have here? He asked, stepping forward. Newborn male, possibly premature. Severe respiratory distress, no audible cries. The brother brought him in, said the mother fainted after giving birth at home, the nurse explained quickly, placing the baby on the examination table. Dr. Collins immediately began examining Caleb. His brow furrowed as he noticed the baby's shallow breathing, the slight blue tint to his lips. We need an incubator, he called out, his voice firm but calm. Get the NICU team in here. Possible hypoxia, we need oxygen support right away. The team worked quickly, placing a mask over Caleb's tiny face to provide him with oxygen. Dr. Collins gently placed his hand on the newborn's chest, feeling the faint rise and fall of his breaths. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Come on, little guy. Stay with me, he murmured under his breath. As the medical team stabilized Caleb, Dr. Collins couldn't help but think about the boy who had brought him in. A 10-year-old had carried his newborn brother through the rain, across the city, to save his life. The thought filled him with awe. He had seen courage in many forms throughout his career, but this was something different. Back in the waiting area, Ethan sat in silence, his body tense as he stared at the emergency room door. He didn't move, didn't blink. The nurse stayed by his side, offering quiet comfort, but Ethan barely noticed. All he could think about was Caleb. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the door finally swung open, and Dr. Collins stepped out. He was still in his scrubs, his face tired but calm. Ethan shot to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. Is Caleb okay? Dr. Collins knelt down to Ethan's level, a small smile on his face. Your brother is a fighter, Ethan. He's stable now, but we're going to keep a close eye on him. You saved his life. The words hit Ethan like a wave of relief, and he couldn't hold back the sob that escaped his throat. His knees buckled, and before he could stop himself, he was crying, tears of exhaustion, fear, and overwhelming relief. Dr. Collins placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, his voice gentle. You were very brave, Ethan. What you did was amazing. The emergency room was a flurry of activity. Dr. Collins moved swiftly, issuing orders as the medical team worked to stabilize baby Caleb. The room was filled with the sound of beeping machines and hurried footsteps, but for Dr. Collins, everything else faded into the background. His focus was solely on the tiny life in front of him, a newborn boy who had been brought in under the most extraordinary circumstances. Get me the incubator. Dr. Collins called out as he examined Caleb. His eyes scanned the baby's small, fragile form. Caleb's chest rose and fell with difficulty, his breath shallow and uneven. The bluish tint to his lips and fingertips signaled oxygen deprivation, a sign that his little body was struggling to get the air it so desperately needed. The nurse beside him quickly wheeled the incubator over, and with practiced precision, they transferred Caleb into the warm, sterile environment. Dr. Collins fitted a tiny oxygen mask over the baby's face, the soft hiss of air filling the silence. For a moment, there was a tense stillness in the room as everyone watched the monitor, waiting for any sign of improvement. Caleb's vitals were weak, but the oxygen seemed to be helping. His breathing, while still shallow, began to stabilize. Dr. Collins exhaled softly, but he knew they weren't out of danger yet. He checked Caleb's heart rate, feeling the faint beat beneath his fingertips. The umbilical cord had been partially wrapped around Caleb's neck during birth, depriving him of oxygen. Severe dehydration was also a concern, given that the baby had been born at home without immediate medical care. Caleb's situation was critical, and Dr. Collins couldn't help but think about the young boy, Ethan, who had brought him in. A child, barely old enough to fully understand the gravity of life and death, had just carried his newborn brother through a storm to the hospital. It was an act of courage so profound that it lingered in the back of Dr. Collins's mind, even as he worked to save Caleb's life. He glanced up at the clock. It had only been minutes since Caleb arrived, but to Ethan, it must have felt like an eternity. Outside the emergency room, Ethan sat in the waiting area, his small body hunched over in the plastic chair. His clothes were still soaked from the rain, and his legs ached from the long run, but he didn't care. He couldn't think about anything other than Caleb. His eyes were fixed on the doors through which his brother had disappeared, and he refused to look away. What if something went wrong? What if Caleb wasn't okay? A nurse approached Ethan with a warm smile, kneeling down beside him. She could see the worry etched into the boy's face, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice gentle, "why don't you come with me for a moment? You can have something warm to drink, and we'll make sure you're taken care of while your brother is being treated." Ethan shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to leave. What if something happens?" The nurse's heart ached for him. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him a small amount of comfort. "I understand. You've been so brave. But you need to take care of yourself too. Your brother is in good hands with Dr. Collins. He's one of the best." Ethan bit his lip, his eyes never leaving the door. I don't want anything to happen to him." The nurse squeezed his shoulder gently. "I know you're scared, but you've already done something incredible, Ethan. You saved your brother's life by getting him here. Now let the doctors do their job, okay?" Reluctantly, Ethan nodded. The nurse guided him to a more comfortable chair, handing him a small blanket to wrap around his shoulders. His fingers were still trembling, partly from the cold and partly from fear. As he pulled the blanket tighter, the reality of the situation began to sink in. His mother was still at home, alone, unconscious. Caleb was fighting for his life. Everything had happened so fast, and now Ethan felt powerless, sitting there, waiting for news. "I'm going to tell the paramedics to go check on your mom," the nurse said as she stood up. "She'll be taken care of soon, I promise." Ethan nodded, though his mind was still consumed by the fear of what might happen to Caleb. He hadn't even thought about himself, about the fact that he hadn't eaten, hadn't rested. His world had shrunk down to one thing, the life of his baby brother. Back in the emergency room, Dr. Collins continued working with his team, adjusting Caleb's oxygen levels and monitoring his vitals. The baby's breathing was stabilizing, but there was still a long way to go. Caleb had experienced a significant amount of stress during birth, and the lack of oxygen could have caused brain damage. It was too early to tell. The thought weighed heavily on Dr. Collins. He had seen cases like this before, where newborns struggled to survive after a difficult birth. Some made it, others didn't. But something about this case was different. The determination in Ethan's eyes, the way he had clutched his brother so protectively, it stirred something in Dr. Collins that he hadn't felt in a long time. A reminder of why he had become a doctor in the first place. To save lives, yes, but also to witness the incredible strength of human will and love. He glanced at Caleb, watching the baby's tiny chest rise and fall with each assisted breath. "You're a fighter," he murmured softly. "Your brother brought you here because he believes in you. Now it's your turn to fight." The hours passed slowly for Ethan. Every time the doors to the emergency room opened, his heart leaped into his throat, but each time it was just a nurse or a doctor passing through. He was exhausted, his body begging for sleep, but he refused to close his eyes. What if he missed something? What if they came out with bad news, and he wasn't ready? The nurse who had been sitting with him brought him a cup of hot chocolate, but Ethan only stared at it, too worried to eat or drink. She sat beside him, quietly keeping him company, understanding that there were no words that could ease the fear gripping his heart. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the emergency room doors opened, and Dr. Collins stepped out. His face was tired but calm, and Ethan jumped to his feet the moment he saw him. Is my brother okay?" Ethan's voice trembled with the weight of the question. Dr. Collins knelt down to be at eye level with the boy, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Your brother is stable, Ethan. He's still in critical condition, but we've got him breathing on his own now. He's a fighter, just like you." Ethan's eyes filled with tears of relief, and he let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. The tears came fast, and for the first time since he had left his apartment, he let himself cry. Dr. Collins, moved by the boy's courage and the overwhelming relief in his eyes, gently pulled him into a hug. "You were very brave, Ethan. What you did today was amazing." Ethan clung to him, his small body shaking with sobs. He had done everything he could to save his brother, and now, for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of that responsibility. "You saved him," Dr. Collins said softly. "Your brother is going to be okay, thanks to you." The hours that followed felt like days to Ethan. He sat in the waiting room, every muscle in his body tense, his eyes fixed on the door to the emergency room. The steady hum of the hospital around him was a blur, nurses walking by, the occasional beep of machines, and the low murmur of voices, but all of it faded into the background. His world had shrunk to that one room beyond the door, where his newborn brother was fighting for his life. The nurse who had been with him earlier brought him a cup of water and a sandwich, but Ethan barely touched them. His stomach churned with anxiety, too tight to eat or drink. He couldn't shake the image of Caleb's small, pale face, so still and quiet in the blanket. What if it had been too late? What if all the running, all the panic, hadn't been enough to save him? Ethan wiped at his eyes, though no more tears came. He felt hollow, his emotions worn down from the weight of the night. In his mind, the scene replayed over and over, his mother fainting, the panic that seized him, the desperate run through the rain-soaked streets. He wondered if his mom was okay. The paramedics had gone to check on her, but no one had come back with news. Time seemed to crawl as he sat there, staring at the clock. Every minute that ticked by felt like an eternity. He couldn't leave, he couldn't rest. What if something happened while he wasn't paying attention? Finally, after what felt like forever, the doors to the emergency room opened, and Dr. Collins stepped out. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat, his body snapping to attention as he jumped to his feet. Dr. Collins walked toward him, still in his scrubs, his face calm, but tired. Ethan couldn't breathe. His hands shook at his sides as he forced himself to ask the question that had been burning inside him for what felt like hours. Is he okay?" Dr. Collins knelt down in front of him, his eyes softening as he smiled. "Caleb is stable now, Ethan. He's still in a critical condition, but he's breathing on his own. We've got him in an incubator to monitor him, but he's a strong little boy. He's pulling through." Ethan let out a shaky breath, the relief crashing over him like a wave. His legs felt weak beneath him, and he had to steady himself against the back of the chair. He's going to be okay?" The words barely made it out, his voice trembling. Dr. Collins placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "He's not out of the woods yet, but the worst part is over. We'll keep a close eye on him for the next 24 hours, but I'm optimistic. You did a brave thing bringing him here when you did. You saved his life." The words hit Ethan like a weight lifting off his chest. He had been carrying that fear with him all night, the fear that maybe he hadn't been fast enough, that he hadn't done enough. But now, hearing Dr. Collins say it, he had saved Caleb's life. He had made the right choice. Tears filled Ethan's eyes again, but this time, they were tears of relief. He swiped at them with the back of his hand, trying to hold them back, but he couldn't stop the sob that escaped his throat. Dr. Collins watched him for a moment before gently pulling him into a hug. It was a gesture that caught Ethan by surprise, but he didn't resist. For the first time that night, he felt the full weight of everything that had happened, and he let himself cry. "You were very brave, Ethan," Dr. Collins said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "What you did tonight was incredible." Ethan clung to him for a few more moments, his small body trembling as he released all the fear, all the tension that had been building inside him. When he finally pulled back, Dr. Collins gave him a reassuring smile. "Would you like to see your brother?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat at the thought. "Can I?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. Dr. Collins nodded. "He's in the neonatal ICU, but you can see him. Come with me." The walk to the NICU felt surreal. Ethan's legs felt shaky, and his mind was spinning, but the thought of seeing Caleb, seeing for himself that his brother was okay, gave him the strength to keep going. Dr. Collins led him through the maze of hallways until they reached a small room, lined with incubators. It was quiet, save for the gentle hum of machines and the soft beeping of monitors. Dr. Collins guided Ethan to one of the incubators where Caleb lay, tiny and fragile but alive. The sight of him took Ethan's breath away. Caleb's face was still pale, and there were wires and tubes attached to him, but his little chest was rising and falling steadily with each breath. Ethan pressed his hand to the glass, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and love. He watched as Caleb stirred slightly, his small hands moving under the blanket. "Hey, Caleb," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me, your big brother. I promised I'd take care of you, and I'm gonna keep that promise." Dr. Collins watched the scene unfold with quiet admiration. There was something deeply moving about the bond between the two brothers, a bond that had been tested but remained unbroken. Ethan, though still a child himself, had shown more courage and love than many adults. "He'll be here for a few days while we monitor him," Dr. Collins said gently. "But if he keeps improving like this, you'll be able to hold him soon." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving Caleb. He stayed by the incubator for as long as they let him, whispering soft words of encouragement to his brother, promising that everything would be okay. The nurse eventually guided Ethan back to the waiting area, where she handed him another blanket and some hot cocoa. This time, Ethan sipped it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through his body. The weight on his chest was still there, but it wasn't as heavy. Caleb was okay. He had made it. As the hours passed, Ethan dozed off in the waiting room, curled up in the chair with the blanket wrapped around him. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that his brother was in good hands. Dr. Collins sat in the break room, leaning back in his chair as the events of the night replayed in his mind. His shift had ended hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the hospital just yet. There was something about this night, about the young boy who had raced through the city, clutching his newborn brother in his arms, that had left a mark on him. After more than a decade in medicine, Dr. Collins had seen countless emergencies. He had performed life-saving surgeries, comforted grieving families, and witnessed both triumphs and tragedies. Over the years, the intensity of the work had hardened him, creating an emotional distance that allowed him to keep doing his job without being overwhelmed by the weight of it all. But tonight had been different. As he sat there, staring at the dim light of the break room, Dr. Collins couldn't shake the image of Ethan, his small, trembling form standing in the emergency room, drenched from the rain, his eyes filled with desperation and hope. A 10-year-old boy had carried his newborn brother through the city to save his life. It was an act of love and courage so pure, so selfless, that it stirred something deep within Dr. Collins, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He hadn't planned to become a doctor for the prestige or the accolades. When he was younger, he had been driven by a genuine desire to help people, to heal, and to make a difference. But as the years wore on, the grind of daily hospital life had dulled that passion. The long shifts, the endless paperwork, the moments of heartbreak, it all built up over time. He had learned to shield himself from the emotional toll, to focus on the tasks at hand rather than the lives he touched. But tonight, seeing Ethan's courage, he was reminded of why he had chosen this path in the first place. There was a purity to the boy's love for his brother, a determination that transcended fear. It was the kind of bravery that couldn't be taught in medical school, the kind that came from the heart. Dr. Collins rubbed his tired eyes and took a deep breath. He had been a doctor for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly connect with his patients on a human level. He had become efficient, skilled, and professional, but somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with the very thing that had driven him to this career: compassion. He thought about Caleb, the newborn who was now stable in the NICU. The little boy had a long road to recovery, but Dr. Collins was confident he would make it. And it was all because of Ethan. The doctor couldn't help but marvel at the strength of the bond between the two brothers, a bond that had saved Caleb's life. Ethan had faced what many adults would have balked at, a life-or-death situation with no one to guide him, and he had risen to the challenge. There was a lesson in that for Dr. Collins. In the hospital, where life and death were often part of the daily routine, it was easy to become desensitized, to view patients as cases rather than people. But Ethan's story had reminded him that every life he touched, every patient he treated, was someone's loved one, a brother, a sister, a child. Feeling a sense of renewed purpose, Dr. Collins stood up from his chair and walked to the window. The rain had slowed, and the night was beginning to quiet down. He thought about the patients still in the hospital, the families waiting anxiously for news, and the doctors and nurses who continued their tireless work. He knew now that he couldn't allow himself to become numb to the humanity in the job. That night had been a turning point for him, a reminder that being a doctor wasn't just about saving lives, it was about understanding the lives you were saving. It was about connecting with people, feeling their pain, their hope, and their love. Ethan's bravery had reignited a spark in him, a spark he hadn't even realized had dimmed. Before leaving the hospital, Dr. Collins made a decision. He would dedicate more of his time to working with young patients, children like Ethan who displayed courage beyond their years. He wanted to help foster that bravery, to be a guide for those who needed someone to believe in them. And more than that, he wanted to ensure that the hospital itself remembered the importance of recognizing acts of love and courage. It wasn't long before Dr. Collins began drafting plans for a new hospital initiative, a program that would celebrate young patients who had shown exceptional bravery and compassion. He would name it in honor of Ethan, the boy who had reminded him of the power of human connection. The Ethan Davis Award for Courage would be a lasting legacy, a reminder to everyone in the hospital that sometimes, the smallest acts of love could make the biggest difference. In the days following Caleb's recovery, the story of Ethan's bravery spread throughout the hospital. Nurses and doctors alike were moved by the young boy's determination to save his brother, and soon, his actions became a source of inspiration to everyone who heard about it. Ethan had done something extraordinary, something that reminded the hospital staff why they chose their professions in the first place. Dr. Collins, in particular, couldn't shake the impact that Ethan's courage had on him. The boy had not only saved his brother's life, but had also rekindled something in the doctor that he thought he had lost over the years, a sense of purpose and a reminder of the deep, human connection that made his work meaningful. Inspired by Ethan's actions, Dr. Collins proposed the creation of a new hospital initiative, a program designed to recognize and celebrate acts of courage and compassion among young patients. He wanted to honor the bravery that Ethan had shown, not only to encourage others, but also to remind the hospital staff of the importance of the emotional and human side of medicine. The program was quickly approved, and Dr. Collins named it the Ethan Davis Award for Courage. The award would be given to young patients who displayed extraordinary acts of bravery, whether through overcoming their own illnesses or in helping others, as Ethan had done for his brother. The first award ceremony was small but deeply meaningful. Ethan, still recovering from the emotional toll of the ordeal, was presented with the award in front of a small gathering of hospital staff. The plaque bore his name, and as Dr. Collins handed it to him, he spoke softly, "You reminded us all of what true courage looks like, Ethan. This award is for you, and for every child who shows the kind of love and strength you did." As Ethan accepted the award, his shy smile was met with applause, and in that moment, the hospital legacy was born. Ethan's story would be remembered, and his bravery would continue to inspire for years to come. 5 years had passed since that fateful night when Ethan had carried his newborn brother through the storm to the hospital. Now, at 15, Ethan walked confidently through the same hospital halls, holding the hand of a healthy and energetic 5-year-old Caleb. The memory of that night had faded slightly, but the bond between the brothers had only grown stronger. As they approached the neonatal ICU, familiar faces greeted them. Some of the nurses who had been there that night smiled warmly at the sight of the brothers, amazed at how far they had come. Caleb, no longer the fragile infant he once was, skipped beside Ethan, his face full of life and curiosity. Dr. Collins, still working at the hospital, spotted them from across the hall. A broad smile spread across his face as he walked over to greet them. "Ethan, Caleb. It's good to see you both," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth. Ethan smiled shyly, nodding in return. "It's good to be back," he replied, squeezing Caleb's hand a little tighter. Dr. Collins crouched down to Caleb's level, his eyes sparkling with fondness. "You've grown so much," he said, ruffling Caleb's hair. "Do you know that your brother saved your life?" Caleb looked up at Ethan with wide eyes, then back at Dr. Collins. "He tells me that all the time," he said with a giggle, clearly proud of his older brother. As they chatted, Dr. Collins couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since that night. The hospital's Ethan Davis Award for Courage had become a staple of the pediatric ward, recognizing the bravery of young patients who, like Ethan, had shown remarkable strength in difficult times. The award had inspired countless families and medical staff, a legacy born from one boy's selfless act of love. Before they left, Dr. Collins knelt beside Ethan and whispered, "You changed many lives that night, including mine. Don't ever forget the power of what you did." Ethan smiled, glancing at his younger brother. "I was just doing what any brother would do," he said. "But I'm glad it made a difference." And with that, the brothers walked out, hand in hand, leaving behind a legacy that would continue to inspire for years to come.